I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You were there once in your life.
Hey people, Trish Wood here. And this is Trish Wood is Critical. We have a very, very full show for you today. We're going to be bouncing around through a lot of topics. The interview for today it's an amazing score, and I'm so glad we got it. You may or may not know, depending on whether or not you follow me on Substack, that I became kind of mini obsessed about the little Titan submersible that went missing / imploded on its way down to visit the Titanic with 5 souls aboard, all who were killed instantly, we know now. And some of us knew at the time, including James Cameron, the film director, and my guest today. So why am I revisiting this? I did a whole big article about it that was pretty complete. But the one piece of this story that I couldn't figure out is why a guy like Stockton Rush, well-to-do, educated, well-brought-up human being, would take the risk he did that day in going down on that vehicle that was clearly not up for the task at hand. The longer we get from that event, the more information that comes out suggesting that this was almost a suicide mission. Think about that. Almost a suicide mission. Many people warned Stockton Rush that the hull could not and would not maintain under the massive, massive pounds per square inch pressure exerted. It's about 6,000 PSI down there. Where it likely imploded, it may have been more like 4 or something, but just, you can't muck about at those depths. The pressure just turns everything to mush if you're not properly protected. And many, many people knew, including Karl Stanley, our guest today, that was a problem. So that's not necessarily the new part of the story. Here's the new part of the story. For me, as a student of human behavior, I can't figure out why he did it. Just saying, oh, greed, that doesn't explain, because he wasn't just risking their lives. He was risking his own life, wasn't he? And he had a wife. I don't know if he had children, but he had a wife he loved. And the fact that he took this risk, which some people are even saying it was almost a sure thing it was going to implode, or the chances of it imploding were extremely high. Why did he do it? Why did Stockton Rush do it? Well, we have maybe a good answer. It's certainly an interesting exploration of the motivations here. And I think it's one for the ages, because what our guest thinks may have been at play, and I happen to agree with him. Actually, it's only my opinion, but I'm going to agree with him because nothing else explains it. He wasn't a stupid guy. He knew the vessel was not worthy for task, so why did he do it? Karl Stanley, who runs a submersible operation out of Honduras, he knew Stockton Rush reasonably well. He'd actually been down on one of the little Titan submersibles on some test drives in the Bahamas, where he heard cracking noises that he exchanged emails with Stockton about. So we're going to hear all of that. It's a very, very interesting, it's almost an historical Captain Ahab story. There will be, mark my words, scripted dramas and many, many nonfiction books written about not just what happened, but primarily the character and nature of Stockton Rush, the man behind it all. This is going to live in infamy and history. Wait for it, people, because there is no way he couldn't have known the danger that he was putting those people in. So I always, I come from true crime, so I always want to know the reason why people do things, do crazy things, do almost murderous things, right? And that may have been what was at play here. So he's our guest today. That's a bit of a switch up for us on this show. But sometimes I just get to do things because I want to do them, and I hope you like it. But I was down the rabbit hole on this before it happened. I happened to be studying deep diving accidents. Weirdly, it's just one of those rabbit holey things I do on YouTube sometimes. I'm a lifelong learner, and I like to learn about things I don't know anything about. And I'd been reading and watching videos of the Byford diving accident, which is the most gruesome diving accident ever. The day before, the Titan went missing. So I was all in for the whole, 5 or 6 days, whatever it is, following it. But I will tell you this, I did figure out on day one, it likely had imploded. I did figure that out. And I'm not very bright. Like, this is not my world. So, and of course, James Cameron knew the day of, people who know about these things knew the day of what had happened. And the Navy sat on the smoking gun, didn't it? Which is the sound that happened, the underwater explosion sound that occurred at precisely the moment that the Titan stopped communicating with the mothership. So that is the story. And we're going to do a very, very forensic look into the mindset of Stockton Rush and how the way he was thinking may have led to this tragedy. So before we get there, I just want to read something to you. Came across my desk yesterday, and I did speak actually to this gentleman's lawyer briefly yesterday, and we're going to have her on at some point. Lisa Bildy, who you may know about, represents a fellow whose name is Richard Bilkstow. And I just want to read this press release that came out from the Save Our Schools at the TDSB in Toronto, Canada. We mourn the passing of Richard, beloved educator, humanitarian friend, and member of Save Our Schools TDSB, Toronto District School Board. Richard worked with the Toronto District School Board for 24 years. He dedicated his life to education. He didn't have his own kids, but touched the lives of thousands who came through the schools where he was a beloved principal. He was an anti-racism advocate who led the nonprofit FAIR Toronto. He visited his elderly mother every weekend to take care of her. Richard was well known and respected by his peers, and a person who was extremely passionate about and dedicated to his job. Today, Richard is no longer with us. He ended his life on July 13th as a result of events which undermined his mental health and well-being. As his family related in a statement, these events began in 2021 when Richard attended an equity seminar held by the TDSB, during which he felt bullied and humiliated by the presenter. The conduct of the speaker was abusive, egregious, and these incidents contributed to plague Richard. That is what was found. Last week, he succumbed to this distress. Richard's death should never have happened. We call on the TDSB to publicly apologize to Richard's family for the bullying of their beloved son, brother, and uncle. We also call on the Minister of Education, Stephen Lecce, to investigate and ensure this never happens again. Our schools must champion equity, but in a manner that is respectful. We must let all voices be heard and not shut them down. He was a great man. He contributed so much to the fight for quality education, for fairness, and a better school system. And we are all so much poorer for his loss. Our heart goes out to his family, friends, and the thousands of students and colleagues he knew and loved, and who loved him. Why do I read that? Not to be melodramatic, but I want to say this. Some of these anti-racist diversity, equity, and inclusion seminars are bullying. They are shaming. They are humiliating. And we've reached a point, I can't speak exactly for what happened in those incidences because I did not see them. I understand there is tape, and I may have a chance to listen to it at some point, and I'm going to be delving deeper into this on the show when I can have more information. But here's what I know in the critical race theory spot right now, that white people are guilty That's how we are treated. And there's nothing we can say or do to change that narrative. They expect us to sit and be insulted and abused. We cannot defend ourselves. If we do, it's called privilege. This has to stop. And the insanity around it, I hope they're not doing this to children in the schools, to white children in the schools or other children, any children. This has to stop. I knew and have known for some time that the result of this kind of cruel and abusive, canceling, inhumane behavior from the left was going to kill people. I can't make a direct connection between what happened to him and his suicide. As I said, some people are saying it was a contributing factor, and it may well have been. I wouldn't be surprised. But as I said, it's hard to know. But what I do know is that decent and good people without a racist bone in their body are being accused and bullied in the name of I don't know what. Maybe being the idea of turning the tables and being hideously racist to white people is seen as some kind of restorative justice. I fully do not understand it because none of it makes any sense either. All civilizations, virtually most civilizations, have misbehaved racially towards another race or tribe or in history, right? But right now, for some reason, worldwide, this has to be stomped out only against white people. This is ridiculous, and it must stop. And I don't know how to do it because, well, no one likes racism and it must be stomped out wherever it exists. This is not the way to do it. You're not changing hearts and minds. You're just scaring people into submission, like McCarthyism. We cannot continue to live this way where we cannot criticize policies around trans extremism. It's not genocide if you say you don't want pornography in the classroom. It's not transgenocide if you say, whoa, maybe we should let them grow up before they take surgeries, top and bottom surgeries, as they're euphemistically called. Maybe we should let them grow up. That's not transgenocide, especially since we know that many kids who think they're trans grow up to be gay. So it's actually conversion therapy against gay people. That's actually what it is. The head of the LGB Alliance in the UK said that, and I thought, wow, that's incredibly smart. So we have to be able to, in a nuanced way, talk about these topics without ugly accusations. Or you know what? People are dying. They will die. They are dying. Suicides are happening and will happen. And the fact that the Toronto District School Board may have been part of this, I guess I assumed that they may have hired the consultants or something that happened in this situation. But again, no direct line. But there are some people suggesting very credibly that his mental health took a big dive after this event. So we have to stop it. We have to stand up. We have to risk it and stand up and say, no more. We're not going to tolerate this anymore. It's cruel and inhumane. And it is the gulag. It is authoritarianism. And we're not going to stand for it. And I'll tell you something, you can't win if you don't stand up. I'm going to be talking about the debanking of Nigel Farage. He's now completely victorious. He went public instantly. He fought it like mad. He managed to get the documents on which they actually based their decision. They are ludicrous, as if they were written by a 16-year-old social justice warrior. Ridiculous, impossible. He was friends with Trump and, Brexit, we didn't like that. And he's right. Just all politics and childishness. And yet Coutts, which is the Queen's Bank, it's the most revered bank in the UK, debanked this person, Nigel Farage, because he didn't attune to their values. He wasn't aligned with their values. It sounds like their values are really dumb too, not well thought out, actually. So What he got to do is what I'm asking you guys to think about doing, and that is to step up and speak out. He has a show on GB News. So the minute it happened, he stepped forward. He said, the Coutts Bank is doing this to me, and I can't get an answer. And the BBC actually lied about it. The BBC said that Coutts kicked him out of the bank because he didn't keep a high enough balance. Completely untrue, and the BBC needs to apologize. But of course, they line up, always the BBC, on the side of authoritarianism, as do the media here. So what Farage did, and I'm going to play for you at the end of the show what is in the 40-page document written by infants, social justice warrior infants masquerading as bankers. I suspect probably with the staffing office, with human resources, with HR. They are the worst in all companies now, right? They're the most woke. Probably them and a few young activist bankers. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, Coutts is one of the oldest banks in the world, and it's run by these imbeciles, these young imbeciles who think questioning a trans thing makes you the worst person who ever lived. I mean, this has got to stop. And it stopped with Nigel Farage on this issue because he had a news program. He could speak up. A lot of other people came forward. The Conservative government under Rishi Sunak in London is moving on this right now to stop it from happening again. I know that we do not have the same platform, but there are people who will hear your story and put you on, including me. So just think about that. He could have hidden away. It's embarrassing to lose your bank account, isn't it? Especially if you're kind of you're no slouch. I mean, Nigel's known by everybody, isn't he? So he had a small victory there. We'll listen to that at the end of the show. And I have a real treat for you, and that is the audio of a young woman testifying before Congress just yesterday or the day before. Her name is Emma Jo Morris. She was the original reporter on the Hunter Biden laptop story. And wait until you hear what she has to say. It's so ludicrous what they did to her. She actually laughs about it. And that's quite a good approach, is when we laugh at people who are being ridiculously authoritarianistic and absurd, right? So wait for that. That's one of the most uplifting pieces of video I've ever seen. So I'll play that for you. That's from Capitol Hill. I'm going to do my pitch, and then we're going to go into this extraordinary interview with Karl Stanley, a friend of Stockton Rush, who has a theory about what happened. So we are listener and on my Substack reader supported, but all the funding is done through Substack. That's where you should go if you feel like supporting this podcast and the work that we are doing more generally. We do have special content for our premium subscribers, which means every now and then you'll get an extra show, or I'll do an Ask Me Anything, which I just did, and it went very, very well. They were such great questions. So we'll be doing more of that. And I have a website, which is trishwoodpodcast.com. My Twitter is info@trishwoodpodcast. And I have an Instagram account, so you can find me there too. So, and I have an announcement about this year's Free Speech and Medicine Conference, which was fantastic last year. So I'm going to talk about that at the end of the show too. So if you're interested in attending this year, and you really must go, it will be so uplifting for you. It's in Bedeck, Nova Scotia, one of the most beautiful places in the world. So I'll have details on that for you later too. But let's just now get into the interview with Karl Stanley, the submersible operator down in Honduras who knew Stockton Rush. The question here is really, and it's kind of one for the ages, right? These things happen with a certain type of person. One of them, remember Captain Smith? He was the captain of the Titanic, wasn't he? And the question over that disaster will always be, why was he speeding through an ice field? What was he trying to achieve? And of course, I think he'd been directed perhaps by the president of the White Star fleet, of which the Titanic was one, to try to beat their proposed time for New York in order to make them look great or something. I mean, that's just silly hubris. One doesn't do that. And sea captains and skippers, as you know, I grew up in that environment out in BC. My family were commercial fishermen and boat builders. You don't muck around, right? And if you're responsible guy, you tell the White Star person, get out of the bridge and leave you to your seamanship, don't you? You don't do what you're told. So that's a big mystery why he did that. Maybe he was looking for a promotion or something. And of course, there's Everest, the story by John Krakauer, Into Thin Air, one of the best books ever written, nonfiction in my view. I read it frequently to learn how to write better. But the story itself, 1996 expedition, 8 climbers killed up in the death zone. And it was because some leaders who were leading the expeditions made really stupid moves. And some of those moves were very likely hubristic. I mean, in Everest is you never have a late turnaround time. I think the turnaround time for reaching the peak is, the summit is maybe 1 or 2 o'clock or something. And if you're not up there by then you're not going to get down safely. That's a really good chance. Most of the accidents, as I understand it, happen during descent. So the same, why did the people who led those expeditions make dumb mistakes? There was a storm. It wasn't just dumb mistakes, but when you're climbing Everest, you have to factor storms in because they happen all the time, even in May, right? So that was another incident that I think this Titan story, this little submersible that imploded, I think it will be seen historically in that same chain of ego and hubris causing catastrophe, right? And then, of course, there's Moby Dick, Herman Melville's story about Captain Ahab missing a leg to a white whale and then spending his life trying to kill it. And in the end, as he harpoons it, he kills himself. So it's a similar thing, ego-driven, revenge, not all that safety-minded. And safety should always be top of mind on the sea, shouldn't it? Or on Mount Everest, right? So here is my interview with Karl Stanley. He's down in Honduras. Hi, Karl. How are you?
Good.
Good. I'd just like to get a bit of a geographical placement of you. Where are you? And I think you're down in Honduras. What are you doing down there? What's your business down there now?
I live on the island of Roatan, Honduras, and I take people on submersible excursions as deep as 2,000 feet.
I guess that's pretty deep, isn't it?
It's the only spot where people can regularly get to those depths.
And what does one see even down there at 2,000 feet? I know we're going to get into the Titan, which obviously went much, much farther and into the dark, as I understand it. But what do you see at 2,000 feet?
Once you get below about 1,700 feet, that's where you pass into total darkness. And that is by far the largest ecosystem on our planet. Water so deep that it's never seen the sunlight. The average depth of the ocean is 14,000 feet.
Wow.
This is basically the best spot in the world for the public to see the majority ecosystem of the planet.
See, I'm both compelled and repelled by it because I am a bit fearful of the dark ocean, as I said just before we started rolling. But I'm also really, really curious about what one would see. So if you were, just giving a pitch to people to go down, what would you tell them they would see? What are the wonderful things that live down there?
I mean, it's like visiting another planet. I can have people that have made 5,000 scuba dives all around the world and give them a guarantee that they will see 100 animals that they never saw before in their life.
Wow. Do people get weepy?
Not so much, but
no,
I mean,
I might.
You can read the reviews on TripAdvisor. People say a lot that it was one of the highlights of their life, one of the most exciting things they ever did. The majority of my customers, they come here specifically to go in the sub from dozens of different countries every year. And most of them are divers and very interested in life in the ocean.
Yeah, when I say weepy, I don't mean in a bad way. I just mean that maybe, you might just feel overwhelmed about the privilege of being in this very special place, seeing these things that no one has seen. I might find that very emotional. That's all I'm saying, Karl. Yeah. Is it for you, or are you kind of used to it?
I mean, it's, an environment that I'm pretty familiar with now, and that's my job, going down there.
Yeah. So you also said, just as we were waiting to roll, that Honduras was not picked for no reason. There's actually something about the ocean's kind of topography there that makes this deep diving extra special. What is it?
I'm on the edge of the Cayman Trench, and literally from my front yard, I can swim out in 10 minutes and be in 1,000 feet of water. And in another 10 minutes, I could be in half a mile deep water.
Yeah. And I guess that's really good for the is it called a submersible? Is that what you?
Submersible. Yeah, it's an ideal location because you completely eliminate the need for a mothership.
Oh, so how does that work? Explain that to me.
I just putter out on my own electric power and dive.
And how do you get it to dive? Do you have to release ballast, or how do you do it?
You let air out of your ballast compartments.
Right. And do you go down fairly quickly or no?
To go to 2,000 feet takes about 45 minutes.
How many can you take in your rig? And what is the sort of normal response of a tourist who's never seen that depth before? What do they say to you? Usually
I take 2 passengers at a time, but really the deciding factor is weight, and the passengers have 520 pounds weight allowance. So probably 10% of the trips I end up doing with 3 people. And more than half of the passengers, when they get down there, they say that they feel like they've landed on another planet. The lighting's different. The landscape's different. You don't even feel like you're underwater because the visibility is so outstanding down there. Quite often I can see the surface from 500 or 600 feet. So you have 200 to 300 feet of horizontal visibility when you get below the major thermocline, which is about 300 feet.
Well, you have a wonderful life, don't you?
A lot of people would say that, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I'll run away to Honduras and come and work for you or something. Those of us stuck in big cities, I am kind of jealous that you've got that lifestyle. But you know why you have it? Because you were courageous enough to make that decision. You said, I want to do this, and I'm going to go do it, right?
That's correct.
And where did you come from, if you don't mind my asking you, Karl?
I grew up mostly in New Jersey, and my dad commuted to New York City every day, left the house when it was still dark, and at a very early age, I saw him come home with his suit after a very long day and told him that I was never going to have that kind of lifestyle.
Yeah. Stressful, right?
Stressful, long hours wasted every day commuting, wearing a suit was not for me.
Getting on that train.
Yeah.
What did he do?
He was a management consultant.
Right. Yeah. So I agree. And the older I get, the less enamored I am with that kind of life. I'm so old now that I don't have too many choices left over for me. I think the next choice I make, it will probably be the last one, but I do believe in third acts in lives. I've had 2 major acts in my life. And I think I want a third one. And it involves rejecting city life in a big way and being more in nature, whether that's a seaside where I grew up or a farm, because I love animals too. So I'm going to have to make that decision, but I'm quite jealous of you. And I think you've got a wonderful life. So let's talk about Titan and Stockton Rush, a story that absolutely captivated the world. And you are here because you have a special insight, both as someone who knew him and someone who understands that business. So let's maybe start by having you paint a picture for me of your relationship with Stockton Rush, how you knew him, things you did together.
I knew Stockton for a little over 10 years, and we had something close to 100 emails back and forth over the years. There was a conference that we would meet up once a year and often go to dinner. I'd been on 2 submersible dives with him, one in Puget Sound in one of OceanGate's other subs, and then the second deep dive in the Titan in the Bahamas.
What did you think of him? What did you make of him?
I mean, I thought he was very driven. When I learned of his vision for a carbon fiber sub, I was very intrigued. And there's a lot of talk on the internet of like, oh, now we all know that carbon fiber doesn't work. It's a terrible choice, but it's actually not. It has flaws and it's tricky, but there have been submersibles with carbon fiber, or not carbon fiber, just fiberglass components that performed flawlessly for years. And there is a company in Rhode Island that is making carbon fiber cylinders for oceanographic equipment that they rate to 6,000 meters, and they have not had a failure. Stockton did not do proper engineering or testing.
So your contention is it's not the carbon fiber necessarily itself that's the issue, but how he was using it and maintaining it and that sort of thing.
He didn't do enough engineering and testing.
Yeah, because that's quite an interesting thing. Because, and I want to get to that a little bit later. But what was your assessment about his? Because this is what everybody's talking about now, about his attitude toward, safety and making sure everything was kind of shipshape, as they say, in maritime circles. Did you have an opinion about that before this tragedy happened? Had you noticed anything or witnessed anything?
Well, I never knew that he was a dishonest person until a month ago. And then after that New Yorker article and reports about people not being able to get refunds when he was unable to deliver what he promised and having to sue to get a refund. That opened my eyes to another side of him. And once you know somebody's capable of lying like that, lying about the nature of his partnerships with University of Washington, NASA, Boeing, he was a liar. So that paints things in a completely different picture. Previously, I was kind of taking him at his word that he had done a lot of he told me he had terabytes of data and had tested extensively, and that was why he knew that it was going to work. And he didn't get into the nitty gritty about the details of his data, but I had no reason to believe that he was just completely making things up.
Yeah, well, why would you think he was making things up? I mean,
exactly.
Right. I mean, that suggests a certain level of sociopathy or something around his personality that you just don't look at people that way when you just don't. I mean, right. And I'm sure he was charming, was he? And, he was sort of handsome and driven, and we like those qualities in people, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you mentioned the New Yorker article, which I didn't actually read. I've read a ton of other stuff about him. I know that he, was accused of cutting corners, and there's pretty good documentation around that. But it was in the New York article, was that where you learned about him refusing to refund money? Was that the gist of it, or what did it say that changed the way you viewed him?
I don't remember a very specific thing in the New Yorker article it was, the last month has been fairly overwhelming in terms of processing all of this.
Yeah, I'll bet.
But let me cut to the chase. Your show is about critical thinking. So I think we have a situation here that is very analogous to the situation on the boat. And the search continued because nobody on the boat was willing to take the information they had and make an extremely difficult, painful call, which is that the sub imploded and that it was not a search, but merely a recovery. And that was really their call to make because they had more information than anybody else. They were there, they were listening, they had they knew the communication logs with the sub. Nobody else had that information. So who else could have declared it an implosion besides them?
Well, let me just stop. Sorry, I just want to stop so people understand. When you say the boat, you're talking about the Polar, whatever it was, which is the
Polar Prince, the mothership for Titan.
The mothership, and that they delayed telling anybody that the Titan was missing.
Well, for 8 hours, they didn't even declare it missing. And then for 4 days, they said they were doing a search and rescue, not that it had imploded. The situation here, all the facts are pointing to he knew how this story was going to end. He was under enormous financial pressure. I believe his co-founder, shareholder, Guillermo, told me over $100 million of shares had been issued. Even at $250,000 ahead, they were a long way from turning any kind of profit with this operation. Really, I don't see how they possibly could have. And the name change in 2018 is a huge indicator that at that point, he already knew how it was going to end. And the name change is significant because Titan was the name of a book written 14 years before the Titanic was in existence that told of a ship of almost identical proportions that left England, hit an iceberg, and sank in the North Atlantic on its maiden voyage. And nobody could understand how a book was written that was basically telling the future. And for him to choose that name, I think he was starting to write a movie with himself as the lead character, and there were too many little juicy tidbits to grab onto to make the story even more flashy. I mean, he basically wrapped himself in the mythology of the most famous shipwreck. And then the whole thing with being married to the descendant of the co-founder of Macy's, that's a whole nother aspect to the story that almost has Twilight Zone Black Mirror qualities to it.
Well, just say who they were. They were the people who, in the movie that James Cameron did, it was, I forget who played it, but it was the couple lying in bed going down with the ship together, right?
Correct.
Was that? Yeah. So that is Stockton Rush's wife, correct?
Great-grandparents.
Great-great-grandparents, yes, who was related to them, yeah. So keep going, Karl, sorry.
And I think he was also, he was a member of the Bohemian Grove, which has not been touched upon by the mainstream media at all. And I had not been aware of this until the last month, and I didn't even know what the Bohemian Grove was until a month ago, but it's creepy as hell. I mean, they go back into the 1800s. They own their own old growth forest 70 miles outside of San Francisco. No reporters are allowed. No women are allowed. Something like half of the ex-presidents in the last 100 years have the people. You have to have such an enormous amount of power and money and to be accepted as a member. There's only about 2,000 members. Some people wait over 30 years to get in and die on the waiting list. And Stockton's father was president, and Stockton got in, but really, what did he have to tell people that he met there, who he was and what he did? He didn't have a lot to say. And he was also the last of 5 children. He was also Stockton Rush III, that even went back farther than that. His name is directly attached to two signers of the Declaration of Independence. Somebody has to understand his motivation of doing this project to begin with. He was already a millionaire. He wasn't doing this for the money. He was doing this to prove to himself that he did something, that he had bragging rights to talk about when he was in these elite circles.
Yeah.
And ironically, I mean, that's really what at least three of his passengers were all about: bragging rights. There's no real other way to put why somebody would spend $250,000 to see the Titanic. The Titanic has a sister ship that's off the coast of Greece in only 300 or 400 feet of water and very close to shore. If you want to see, you can see an identical ship much easier and safer without going all the way out in the middle of the Atlantic and seeing this broken up wreckage. And nobody's going to pay $250,000 for that. It's not about the ship. It's strictly bragging rights and the name recognition that the Titanic has, thanks in partially to James Cameron's movie.
I just want to stop you, Karl, because I think that's a very, very interesting thing that you just said. And like you, I have had a long career in journalism, and I always wonder why people do things. Like, to me, that is the big question over Titan. We know why it imploded. We know what happened. I want to know what was driving this guy, because the more we learn about the actual facts and details of what led up to this terrible tragedy for these human people, the more I cannot figure out what his deal was. I mean, every
part of this was motivated by ego and bragging rights, him and his customers.
Yeah, it's absolutely makes no sense, because, for me also, if I was going to do a thing like that, I would have researched it a little bit better. I mean, would it have been, not in any way to blame the people who died, but would it have been difficult to discover that the little Titan was as dangerous as it turned out to be? Was that in the public domain anywhere? Could you have researched it if you were a potential customer?
There definitely wasn't the information out there that's out there now.
Wow.
You would have,
shocking.
And there was also a lack of options. I mean, if you decided seeing the Titanic was worth the expense and risk, and you had to brag to your friends that you saw that was your only option.
Yeah. This is maybe a little bit out there, but are you alluding to, or is it possible even that this might have been a bit of a suicide mission for him?
I don't think it started out like that, but I think at some point that was the only door left open to him, except declaring bankruptcy and failure and retiring the craft, saying that, he painted himself into a very tight corner. I would imagine that a large chunk of his investment came from these Bohemian Grove friends. How do you tell that circle of people that all their stock is worthless and your carbon fiber idea wasn't working out the way that you thought?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, or anybody. I mean, yeah. Right? When people who portray themselves as one thing in the public eye are revealed to be something they're not, sometimes failure is just not an option for these people. And, whether he kind of...
failure was the option.
Failure was the option, yeah. And whether he deliberately said, well, I'm going to go down and kill all these people with me, or just said, I don't care how dangerous this is, I'm going to do it, right? It's still, that is one of the few explanations I've heard that makes sense of why Stockton would take a risk and put other people at risk in such an obvious way. Let's talk about what was known, because you went, I know now, obviously, that there were quite a few warnings about this little submersible. And you actually went down in the Bahamas in it, didn't you?
Yes. I was on the second deep dive.
Of this particular one? The one that's just...
Supposedly, he made an entirely new hull. I was not provided any evidence of that, and I have not been able to speak to anybody that can actually confirm that an entirely new hull was made. And I saw one interview with somebody talking about a hull being reinforced. So I don't know.
And you experienced something disturbing, didn't you?
From the very first dive, the hull was making loud noises, which were the carbon fiber bands breaking up. And he told us ahead of time that was going to be the case. He was down there by himself on the first dive, listening to those sounds, and tried to play it off like it wasn't a big deal. He even has a quote about those are the weak fibers letting go, and it's like thinning the herd, and the ones that are left are the stronger ones, and so you've actually somehow improved your hull. There are a couple things here that show, in my mind, more facts that he knew it was going to implode at some point, and that is the dive that we did in the Bahamas. We could have had five people in there. We only had 4. And there was literally 100 people on shore that would have loved to fill that 5th seat, some of whom I'm sure would have paid a nice chunk of change to do so. And he didn't give anybody that option. And I think he already knew that how close to the edge we were. There's actually 3 things. So then the second is, we didn't go. The idea was to test it for Titanic depths. And you're basically able to control where you start your dive by how far out you tow. And we stayed shallower than the Titanic. And even though we drove towards deeper water during the dive, we were still about 400 feet shallower than the depth the Titanic is at. He could have easily towed for another 10 minutes and we would have landed in water 500 feet deeper than the Titanic, and it would have been a better test. But he was nervous about doing that for a reason. And additionally, I didn't ask. He gave me the controls and let me drive when we were down there. And he didn't offer that to anybody else. And I believe it's because he knew that I understood the situation. The 2 other passengers really had no expertise in submersible operations design at all. One was a young sonar technician, and the other was a longtime friend of his who worked at the company, but that might have been his first submersible dive, as far as I know. Right. I think that he knew that we were close to possible implosion right there, and he was basically letting me be in control of my own destiny a little bit. That was his version of like informed consent right there. The other thing that points to him knowing that it was going to end like this, he never bothered with overpressure test. It is industry standard classification rules from any organization. You have to test your vehicle's hull for 20% either in the ocean or in a pressure chamber, 20% more than whatever your operating depth is going to be. And I asked him in writing if he was going to do that, and he said no. Maybe he was going to do 10%, but that he had more faith in his real-time monitoring, which is basically just recording the cracking sounds and trying to see a pattern emerge of when you're going to implode.
That's so scary. I can't believe that.
Had never been done before. Yeah. And so, you know, why does somebody think that listening to the cracking sounds and measuring them is better than actually putting the thing in the ocean and testing it for, he never even did 10%. It's like he was literally designing it to be as close to the limit. And that's what he really wanted to know, how close to the edge I am. And the more facts that come out, the more I'm convinced he knew how the story ended. It's just a matter of when he made up his mind to go down that route. And
Wow.
I would say from the name change, we can put that back to at least 2018 and work backwards from there.
What did he change it from?
It used to be Cyclops 2.
Okay. That's interesting. So I just want to get back to this pressure hull because the Substack I wrote was so weird because I go down these weird rabbit holes when I'm bored, and I was on YouTube watching videos made by divers about decompression injuries. I just crazily do these things. I like to learn things I don't know, and one of the videos was about the Byford diving accident, that terrible accident where 5 people were kind of blown to bits by this instant. It's a really interesting medical phenomenon, right? Quite gruesome. And so the day after I'd been doing all that reading, the Titan story broke. So I was absolutely glued and my first instinct as an absolute nobody was, wow, that thing probably imploded. I thought that, just silly old me, right? Based on what I've been reading. So I was glued to it. But my feeling all along was that I think most people watching it on the news were not getting the kind of information from news anchors or others about the implosion part of this, that was always a very real problem on a little vessel like that, wasn't it? And if you could maybe just explain for my listeners who don't know about this stuff, why the pressurized hull was so important and what happens to you when that hull is breached. Like, what series of events take place when that happens? Because I think people don't really understand what happened here.
Well, first of all, I mean, people need to understand the difference between a submersible and a submarine. A submarine is a larger military application vehicle that has armaments and is moving around at high speeds, might have nuclear power on board. A submersible is small, research-based, doing much shorter trips, no weapons on board. This is the first time in human history that a submersible has imploded. So there was an element of shock and disbelief that this would even happen. Like James Cameron said, I mean, it was completely avoidable. With proper testing and engineering, there's zero reason why your pressure hull should implode. It's just a complete failure, or he was designing it to do something else. The actual mechanisms of what happens was there was cumulatively 127 million pounds of pressure squeezing that hull at that depth. That when the pressure hull failed, it fails at the speed of sound, faster than the speed of sound. And the air that is in there, because it's being compressed so quickly for 0.2 milliseconds, heats up hotter than the sun.
Wow.
But then the force turned that carbon fiber tube into something like confetti. But the pieces that are reacting to that enormous release of energy, you basically have a million little carbon fiber knives going through the water column for a split second there, as well as whatever airspace was in your body when that happened is also subjected to those compressive forces. So your lungs and your sinuses are also, I mean, those, whatever human remains they were able to recover are probably, little chunks with char marks on them that fit in a jar and have to be analyzed for DNA. It was an extremely violent event.
And that is because, just to explain the pressure, say the pressure on land is X PSI, the pressure at that depth is what is it, 6,000 PSI or something, or 4?
The pressure down there is double what is inside of a scuba tank.
Okay.
Quite literally, you could put a full scuba tank down to the Titanic and it would be crushed even with 3,000 PSI inside of it.
Wow. Wow. So the other thing I want to ask you about in this context, because there's been a lot of writing about, the last moments of the people on that little craft. And because it would seem, and I'm not sure if I'm correct about this, but it was reported, and I thought it was true, there was some discussion that ballast had been dropped from the Titan, and
that's all conjecture at this point. I haven't seen anything that I believe that seems like hard evidence about that.
Because that scenario is that they'd heard some cracking or something and had a time to react, and that they were maybe trying to hightail it back up or something. But let me ask you this, Karl, based on what you know about that craft and how these things might play out, is it the most believable that it happened instantly, or is it as believable that there had been warning cracking sounds and they knew inevitably what was coming? Is that also possible?
I would say it's quite unlikely that they had 14 minutes of reaction time and were unable to drop weights or achieve positive buoyancy. There were no other external components on there that could have flooded. Their batteries, their electronics, they were all filled with oil. So they might have heard a little more cracking before it completely gave way. But in terms of anything that would have made it impossible for them to achieve buoyancy with 14 minutes, none of that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. I guess I'm just wondering, because I know it with insurance companies, this is a gruesome thing to say, but they do pay more if people had even 15 seconds or a minute of understanding that they were about to die, right? I know with the Lockerbie air crash, there was some kind of grim contentions made that there were people, I think they found a person alive still in their airline seat after the plane had broken up over Lockerbie, Scotland. And so those things are taken into account when they're paying out damages, which I'm assuming if Stockton was insured, that's going to be hashed out maybe in a court of law sometime. That's why I asked you the question, because
I would assume he was not insured. I don't know.
Really?
Why somebody would insure an operation like that.
Yeah, me neither. So let's just go back a little bit too. So I want to just ask you went down, you heard noises. You, as I understand it, you sent emails to Stockton Rush, did you not, warning him or saying, look, there's something?
Yeah. After our Bahamas dive, I sent him about 3 pages worth of emails telling him that he had to figure out what was making the noise, that he, in any event, was not ready to bring that whole operation into the middle of the ocean and start charging people for dives, that he had to have more experience. And I tried to compare it to scuba diving license, skydiving license, flying license, that they're benchmarks that are about hours and experience before they let you progress to the next stage. And he was willing to start charging people on deep dive number 3. And he had never done any dives without major system failures. And when he did get out there and all kinds of things were going wrong, and I've read that if you were to measure the success of his operation by people laying eyes on the Titanic that paid to do so, he only had a 14% success rate and a horrible refund policy, if you could even call it that. It's like if you failed to see the Titanic, you were offered a spot on the boat next year, and you could sit around for 10 more days in the high seas waiting for your chance to be in the lucky 14%. And I mean, just from a sheer customer relations, honest business person perspective, like, why are you going to go through all that when you're unable to even deliver half the time to your customers what you promised them. And he was somehow proud of that it showed that he was innovating, that, the more he failed, he spun it into, well, you can see that I'm trying and innovating and doing bold new things. It's like, well, figure that out on your own time and then start offering it to the public.
Yeah. I think innovation has become one of the most dangerous words in the English language right now. I hear it used in all kinds of scary ways to justify a whole bunch of bad stuff, like cutting corners. Let me ask you, I just want to go back to this trip that you went on when you heard these sounds, just to really paint a picture for people. So you're on the Titan, and you're hearing sounds. And tell me what the sounds sounded like and what they said to you about what was happening mechanistically to the hull of that submersible.
Bands of carbon fiber were breaking. In an email to me, Stockton said it was a noise like fireworks, and I described it later as small caliber gunshots. But imagine, like a beam getting a very heavy load, and bit by bit it's cracking, but your beam is carbon fiber and has incredibly strong strings in it, that those are what are breaking when the forces are being applied. It was a lot of energy being released. But the scarier part about it all, which I addressed in one of my emails to him, was that the hull was still making loud noises on our way back up as shallow as 300 feet. Oof. So that's not even the pressure breaking things. That is, the hull had permanently deformed, was storing energy within it, and that energy was being released as we came back up, which you've really made a mess out of your hull for it to start doing that.
And just to be clear, I know you addressed this earlier, but I just want to be clear so I fully understand. So did he remake the hull, or did he fix? I mean, what did he do as a result of this?
He didn't. He told me he wanted to go out and he wanted to dive. Even after that experience, he wanted to go. He had already promised people. He already had badges and T-shirts and stickers made up. He was hell-bent on going out there a few months after the Bahamas dives. And I remember a heated conversation with him where I told him he did not have a marketable product because there was no possible way that 4 passengers would be in there with him and hear those kinds of sounds, and not one of the 4 people would freak out and demand to go back to the surface.
Yeah.
So what was, how did he think that it was possible that you could get trip after trip with 4 people listening to those sounds and nobody complaining? And I think that was what got through to him. Actually, Guillermo, is co-founder, told me that it was actually my insistence on those points that he scrapped that season's diving, and he said he made a whole new tube. But again, the fact that I was down there and I even isolated exactly where the sound was coming from, and he confirmed to me in an email that he had found a defect, but the fact that I was down there risking my life and identified it and everything, he could have sent me some photos. He could have given me some more information, like, hey, like, you were right. Here's the pictures, blah, 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 blah. This is what it's like. He wasn't sharing information like that with anyone.
Oof. And so let me just ask you this, Karl, when this event was playing out, did it, it must have tormented you somewhat that the doomed people on Stockton's vessel may have heard the very same kind of sounds that you heard that day.
My assumption is that hull was either that hull, the second hull. I mean, Stockton is actually on video saying that a carbon fiber hull making sounds is a normal thing. Guillermo just gave an interview where he said that that's normal and to be expected. You know, he was probably spinning it to his passengers that, oh, don't worry, I have my real-time monitoring system and everything's under control.
But I don't understand the real-time monitoring system. Like, if you're going to implode, if you're not at the top really quickly, which you can't do, you're only monitoring your own demise, aren't you? I mean, it's kind of a ludicrous proposition, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's, you know, James Cameron's got a good quote on that. If your idea of safety is listening to the sound of your hull breaking, you're doing it wrong.
God bless him. Yeah. I was not a fan of his until this happened, and now I am a fan of his. He definitely knows his stuff when it comes to the deep sea, which I'm very interested to see how this plays out with. Guillermo just gave an interview where he says James Cameron doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to OceanGate's carbon fiber hull, and he basically needs to, you know, keep his opinions to himself, and says that there's only 4 people that have come out and publicly spoke against OceanGate's engineering. Myself, James Cameron, Will Cohen, who's the head of the Marine Technology Society Manned Underwater Vehicle Committee, and David Lockridge, who was arguably the most experienced, skilled engineering-wise person they ever had at OceanGate, who they fired and took to court. So, yeah, only those 4 people. I mean, I don't know how you're going to get a short list of 4 people with more authority to speak on the subject, and he's somehow poo-pooing that as, like, you know, not good enough. Well, that's a very arrogant thing for him to say, too. You'd think he would be a little bit more circumspect, given what we're looking at now. Yeah. And let's just talk about David Lockridge, because David Lockridge, as you say, is a highly estimable expert, and he was fired, but he was fired for pointing out safety problems, wasn't he? I mean, it was, they didn't want to hear it. So let's just wrap up here. I want to talk to you about the alert was not sounded for 8 hours, as I understand it. Why do you think that was? Who would have issued the alert, and why did they not issue it within minutes of losing contact with the Titan?
I think there was a power vacuum on that boat, and the person, well, Wendy, Stockton's wife, was chief communications officer. So any, you know, sharing of information, that's in her wheelhouse. And I don't think that she was in a mindset to declare herself a widow in front of, you know, on a boat full of people that there's no escaping. You're all in this closed environment. There's, you know, you got to eat your meals at the same place. You can't, you're stuck there with those people. And the wife and daughter of the Pakistani father and son were on that ship as well. And
Mrs. Dawood, I believe. Dawood? Yeah.
None of us can even imagine the anguish of having to make that call. So,
yeah.
But that, I think, was up to Wendy, and she didn't do it.
And at the end of the day, it wouldn't have made a difference particularly, but it did enable this charade of this, you know, we're doing this. It's still a rescue mission. And
yeah, there's an argument to be made that lives were unnecessarily put at risk, that there were, you know, anytime that you're going out on the ocean, there's a risk involved, and people doing things in a hurry because they thought they were other lives at risk. There's probably more risk than just doing a normal operation, and it was all, you know, an unnecessary risk.
Yeah. And I guess for me as a media person, just watching the charade, you know, they had countdown clocks for the 90 hours of oxygen and all this stuff. And so when James Cameron said, well, gee, it imploded, and everybody knew that, and not only did they know it, but the Navy has some kind of an audio print from exactly the moment it stopped communicating. And I thought, well, why have we been dragged through this? Number one. And number two, why didn't the Navy? I know they probably have some military reason for not saying it, but honestly, it was a ridiculous farce, if you ask me. What was it like for you, if you don't mind my asking, watching this thing play out? What was your first thought of what had happened? How did you first hear about it? And then what was your first thought about what had actually happened to the little Titan?
I just got done with a week-long off-grid camping trip, and this all happened. The sub went missing the day that I got back to the island. And when I first heard that they lost tracking and comms at the same time, I immediately thought implosion. And they have backup power sources. Any sub would have redundant power, and the communication in particular would have backup power to it. So to lose both of those things simultaneously, really implosion is the only thing that makes sense. And I was on the phone a lot those days with other people in the industry, and nobody wanted to say it. And I asked some of them very directly. I'm like, what other scenario does a submersible lose tracking and comms? And nobody could really. One person tried to give me an answer of like, oh, they got down to the Titanic and maybe they got swept into the wreckage, or they got entangled and they ripped off the transducer and something like that. However, for something like that to happen, they would have had to reach the bottom. And the people on the mothership knew how far off the bottom they were when they lost signal. So again,
an hour, 45 minutes.
Yeah, that's
right. An hour, 45.
Yes.
Yeah. And how much farther down to the Titanic in time? Was it like a 2-3 hour trip down? Were they halfway?
I think they were maybe 1,000 feet from the bottom, something like that. But the fact that, if they had reached the bottom, the mothership would have known that. Right there. If the people on the boat knew that the sub had not reached the bottom yet and they lost contact, there's no other scenario.
So you guys was there a bunch of you kind of in this industry sending emails around and
mostly on the phone, some emails.
Yeah. And so people just didn't want to say it. Is that right?
Yeah, no, everybody that I was speaking to, I was the one saying, what else can it possibly be other than an implosion? And everybody's like, well, it's still a search and rescue until we know otherwise. Nobody wanted to admit it.
Wow. And so I don't know. I think we should always be telling the truth, even if it's sad. I mean, the fantasy that they were caught and could be rescued in the most, incredible deep sea rescue in the history of the world, which is it was just so stupid. I get mad at media for being dishonest about these things, and yeah. And I think also that maybe the publicity around Stockton was, there were reporters who were kind of cheering him on a bit and, aren't these great adventurers? I remember when this was happening. I don't know how you feel about this, and I don't mean to be mean. I really don't. But I don't think you're a great adventurer because you buy a ticket on a sub to go down. Like, I don't know if that's not like, really, it's not like climbing Everest.
Actually,
maybe it's as dumb as climbing Everest.
Everest is an interesting example.
Analogy, yeah. Lots of dead bodies up there, right?
Yeah,
on high on the mountain. Yeah.
The British billionaire Hamish, the one that was selling used aircraft in Dubai, he was scheduled to climb Mount Everest next year, actually with a former customer of mine, who they were both members of the Explorers Club. And climbing Mount Everest is actually shockingly similar to the whole thing with going to go see the Titanic, in terms of you are putting your own life at risk and other people's lives at risk for bragging rights.
Yeah.
And 17 people died on Everest this year, not including the 6 people that died in the helicopter crash on the mountain. And the majority of the deaths over time have been the Sherpas who have to spend the most time in the most dangerous areas, making the trail, putting the ladders, putting the ropes. And they're carrying your gear. You know, it's nowhere near the personal achievement of the first people that summited that mountain. Not even close.
Well, remember the John Krakauer book, Into Thin Air, which is a favorite book of mine. I reread it every couple of years because he's such a terrific writer. But that particular expedition had some wealthy New York socialite climbing with a sat phone so she could be emailing from the summit of Everest, and all her gear was carried by Sherpas.
Exactly.
They're schlepping, you know, it was just insane. So you're actually quite right. It's actually a better analogy than I thought, Rush. But you know, and they leave the bodies up on the mountain and they don't collect most of them. They just kind of stay there forever. And this is an interesting thing, because when they were pushing the idea that they were alive at the bottom of the ocean, I did think about Rob Hall, the guy who died in the Krakauer expedition story, and he died just at the South Summit. He was trapped there, but he had a radio phone. And while he was dying on the South Summit, he was speaking to his wife in New Zealand. I mean, can you imagine? Wow, that's just like the most sort of incredible thing. But it is similar, and it does attract. I know a lot of kids a lot of people from my kids' school. It was a trendy thing to do. The parents were summiting Everest. They had money and they could do that. It was a bucket list thing, and
it's a bragging rights thing.
Yeah,
but the equation is identical to what Stockton was offering in terms of. You're putting your life and other people's lives at risk for your ego and to brag.
I'll wrap up here. I'm so grateful for all the time you've given us, Karl. This is just really fascinating. I mean, I've been obsessing about this story for weeks, so I'm really happy to talk to you. But so what do you take away from it? I mean, you are deeply ensconced in this industry. You understand it and the kind of physics of everything that happened really well, but he was also a friend, sort of, wasn't he? I mean, he was somebody you liked and didn't wish any harm.
Yeah.
So what are your feelings around this thing? They must be really conflicted. A tragedy happened, and that's really sad, but it's a tragedy that didn't need to happen. So that's really kind of something else entirely, right? Like it's hard to, or is this just at the end of the day, you don't screw around with the ocean because the ocean always wins? I mean, which one of those things is the narrative here?
I wouldn't say the ocean always wins. I would, another submersible pilot that I'm friends with has a little plaque on their office wall or something saying the ocean is always trying to kill you, but yeah. You don't have to let it kill you, you know, you have to be smarter.
Yeah.
And take the proper precautions.
Yeah. But I preface that by saying, if you're screwing around, right? If you're screwing around, I think the ocean wins. If you're playing it smart, I think the ocean doesn't always win. But I think if you're being stupid, it kind of does. Yeah.
I think this is an interesting lesson in examining people's motives. And once you can understand motives, you understand outcomes to some extent, because that really changes the trajectory. And this entire operation was about ego gratification for the creator, for the clients, and that's not the right reason to undertake something like that.
You called you said that Stockton created a mousetrap for billionaires. What a great phrase. What did you mean by that, Karl?
Well, I think at some point he knew how that implosion was the most likely outcome. And from at least 2018, when he changed the name, I would say he knew from that point. I don't think he started the company with that intention, but it's possible that he might have.
Yeah.
I think if we start looking at this a little bit like Dexter with an engineering degree, a lot of the pieces fit together
Yeah.
a lot nicer.
Well, you're talking about a major personality disorder, right? And that's really interesting because obviously these things have to be analyzed when we're looking at this, because this makes no sense logically. If you just examine it and say,
exactly.
wow,
Why would you not test it 10, 20% deeper if you wanted to live and actually, why would you have experts in carbon fiber pressure vessel design offer you their consulting and tell them that you can't be bothered to talk to them? There's nothing that makes sense unless you think, maybe he just decided to go out with a bang and take some billionaires for maximum headlines and wrap himself in the mythology of the Titanic wreck. Everything starts making sense when you look at it like that.
1,500 plus 5 more, right? Now, there was something I just want to ask you about, because I was able to pull it up while we were talking. This is a pretty devastating email that you sent in 2019 in August, Karl Stanley to Stockton Rush. There is an area of the hull that is breaking down and it will only get worse. Wow. Mm-hmm. I mean, you couldn't have been any more correct than that. I guess it's something you wish you hadn't been correct about, right?
Yeah.
Given what happened. Yeah. Wow. It's really interesting. I know in the history, and I think you are on to something with this analysis. And I'll tell you why, because aside from being a journalist, I'm a storyteller. And a lot of these big adventurer stories where things go awry, they go awry because the person leading them was driven by dark forces, right? All the way back to Moby Dick.
Yeah.
There's always, in these tragedies, there's almost always, and on Everest too, there's been expedition leaders who were crazy and got their people killed. So, it's time to look at this as well. I don't think it's mean to actually look at Stockton's behavior and what his motivation might be, because it's completely causing cognitive dissonance for me to look at this in any other way. There had to have been something psychiatrically or psychologically wrong with him to pursue this in the way he was, risking not only his life, but the lives of others as well.
Yeah, I think it's also an indictment of our whole culture. I mean, there's literally people risking their lives to get the perfect selfie and dying on a regular basis doing only that. This is on a whole nother level. And I mean, that his customers were the kind of people that were willing to risk their life to go up Everest to have another notch on their belt to tell their friends at cocktail parties. Like, it goes way beyond Stockton. There's way too many people doing crazy stuff just to tell their friends. And it's specifically in America, I would say, is, this culture of narcissism and needing their 15 minutes of fame and thinking, wanting their own reality show. And you don't see that in too many other countries to the extent that you do in America.
No, it's very true that people seem to think their lives are empty if it's not being reflected back at them through some kind of social media, right? It's a really dangerous phenomenon, not just for us, but mostly, especially, I think, for our children too. And I also just want to say one thing, that there is heroism in this story, but it's not the heroism of the people who went down in that little submersible. It's the people who are speaking up about what happened. And so sometimes heroism isn't the big selfie, people. It's just quietly telling the truth about an event. And you have done that. And so have a few other people. So I think, is David Lockridge speaking out too, or what's?
No, there's radio silence there. I've emailed him, and I haven't, nobody that I've spoken to has spoken to him directly.
Why do you think he's being quiet? I know his criticisms were made and they made public. There was a lawsuit. I wonder if he signed an NDA. He may have, actually,
possibly.
Right? Yeah, that would make sense, because there was a lawsuit, and that's how things go these days if they settle.
Nobody from the company is even speaking out. I suspect that the people closest to the center of all this, if I can see that at some point he switched gears into knowing that he was making a mousetrap, there's people closer to everything that see it even more clearly now. And how do you go on the record and start discussing that you're ex-husband, former employer, was also plotting a murder-suicide on the company dime and publicizing it all,
Yeah. Well, it's this is not your hypothesis is not, it's not unbelievable. It's actually quite believable given what we now know.
There's a new mass shooting every couple of days. This is just doing it in another way.
Yeah, I know. It's an astonishing story. And I'm really, really grateful for you helping us to understand it. It is an historical moment, and films and books will be written about this event.
I'm sure.
There's no question about it. And maybe like Into Thin Air or the book, The Perfect Storm, again, another story of sort of tragedy at sea, and maybe mistakes being made, maybe not. We don't actually know what happened with the Andrea Gale because she sunk, I think, without even an EPIRB activated, actually, which is quite strange. But so it's just, it will become lore, and maybe we'll learn even more about it in the future at some point. But thank you for doing this. I'm really, really grateful. And I'm glad you're having a nice life in Honduras. I wish I was there too.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm very grateful, Karl. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was Karl Stanley talking about Stockton Rush and the Titan submersible that was lost, 5 souls aboard. So 1,500 down with the Titanic is adding 5 more. And in the Substack, I wrote about this, which you can find on my Substack. It's called Ocean Gate, just being clever there. I play at the end of it, I have a little video of the I think it's an old English hymn, and it's called Men in Peril on the Sea. They play it at the end of the Perfect Storm movie as well. And so it was my little homage to the people. And it's one of my favorite hymns, I'll have you know. So if you want to hear it and think about the people on the Titan and maybe on the Titanic too, right? You can play it and maybe think about them for a minute. Okay. Nigel Farage. So he got the goods on them. It's so great. I was cheering. I couldn't believe we won one for a change. Because all the lefties were lining up against Farage because they hate him. And somehow he got this 40-page document. So it's 8 minutes long. And I find his voice a little irritating, but stick with it because the information he is delivering in it will knock your socks off. That they actually debanked a very high-profile politician / TV star in the UK because they were friends with Trump and spearheaded Brexit and all the other stuff, dumb stuff they accuse. I mean, it's absolutely juvenile and scary because these are juveniles and scary who have the power to steal your bank account. And that is going to be happening here. So be aware and be ready. So here's Nigel Farage.
So I put in what's called a subject access request to Coots, the bank, who decided they wanted to close me out. I wanted to find out why. What was the reasoning behind them closing the account? Now, as you know, they had briefed the BBC that it was to do with lack of funds and nothing else. Well, here's the document. It is an incredible 40 pages. It reads rather like a brief that you'd give to a barrister ahead of a serious criminal trial. I mean, from the tone of this document, I must be one of the worst human beings ever to have inhabited this planet. But I guess if you were, upper middle class, wealthy, London, metropolitan elite, then that's perhaps how you would view me. Although quite what this has to do with banking and commerce, I don't really know. Let me give you just a few pointers as to what's in this document. Word searches are really interesting. Brexit is mentioned 30 times. Well, I think it's quite very easy to understand that. I don't think the globalist establishment, I don't think the corporates ever forgave anybody directly involved in the Brexit movement. They didn't accept the result of the referendum, and I guess they never ever will. Russia is mentioned 22 times, with links to a whole series of articles that appeared in The Guardian and elsewhere, attempting to link myself and Arron Banks to Russia, and indeed to Russian funding. All of that has been disproved. with Arron Banks winning his court case, his libel action against Karl Cadwalader, the journalist involved, who wrote these things. But that's fine. All these people do is take every negative press article about me they possibly can and collate it in this document. Twice in this document, Sir Chris Bryant is mentioned. I hinted a couple of weeks ago I thought this could be behind it. And sure enough, twice the accusation made under parliamentary privilege that I'd received over £500,000 in 1 year from the Kremlin is mentioned in this document and constitutes quite a big part of their conclusions. Donald Trump, well, of course, he gets a mention. 14 times Donald Trump is mentioned. The fact that I support Donald Trump is, again, part of this charge sheet. Racist is mentioned 9 times, well, I thought it might be, and politically exposed person 5 times. Let me just give you 1 or 2 quotes from this that might be instructive. The client's financial position is now sufficient to retain on a commercial basis. The decision to close me down was made at a meeting on November the 17th last year on the Wealth Reputational Risk Committee. They got together and decided that once the small mortgage I had with them expired in 2023, they would get rid of me, even though I met the financial criteria on a commercial basis, contrary to what was spun to the BBC. They haven't told the truth on this, and I'm pretty blooming angry about it. But now we get into what this report's really all about. One, it is accepted that no criminal convictions have resulted. Gosh, they sound disappointed, don't they? Commentary and behaviours that do not align with the bank's purpose and values have been demonstrated. So the bank has a series of values. The bank has a series of political positions. And as for purpose, well, I thought the purpose of companies was to act ethically, yes, of course, but to return to their shareholders dividends. And in this case, folks, do you know who the shareholders are? It's you and me. This bank is part of the RBS group. It's 38.6% owned by us because we bailed them out in 2008 after their greed and short-sighted stupidity. We are the shareholders, but they're more bothered about putting up rainbow flags and being popular at dinner parties in Chelsea than they are about actually making money. When considering our stance, this is the bank's stance, specifically on ESG, diversity and inclusion, the comments and articles are not in line with our views or our purpose. That word purpose coming back again. I go on. He is seen as xenophobic and racist. Oh, charming. That's nice, isn't it? That really is lovely. Thank you so very much indeed for that. And here's the final one. In making the decision, risk factors, including accusations of links to Russia and controversial public statements, which are felt to conflict with the bank's purpose. So let's be clear. The decision to get rid of me wasn't financial. It was done because somehow I don't fit with their values. They were bailed out by us. They have a duty to run at a profit as a commercial business. But no, they are to be the moral guardians of all. And that's because the march through the public and private corporate sectors of left-wing institutions who want to change the way the world is, organizations like Stonewall, has led us exactly to where we are. And I guess it's not just Coots, because I've been refused by 10 other banks. I will not get a UK bank account. That is done, dusted, over. Mercifully, in the modern world, there are fintech solutions where I can receive and pay money. I won't be able to earn interest on that money. I won't be able to borrow money. It won't be a full bank account, but I will be able to exist and survive. So is this all about me? No. Since I broke this story, the number of people who've been in touch with me, who've been summarily closed down by the banks, because, see, the banks don't have to give any explanation. There's something called the tipping off rule, which means they don't have to tell you, for example, if the police are investigating your affairs. I'm not sure they've ever been challenged fully, publicly, over closure of bank accounts the way that I've done. The number of people running little businesses, window cleaners, taking cash. No, we don't want your business anymore as we move towards a cashless control society. Worst of all is this. Above our banks are a series of international agencies, the biggest of them being a firm being called Refinitiv. Okay. Banks go to that firm to see what our creditworthiness is, whether we are an acceptable risk to lend money to, for example. Now, I don't blame the banks for protecting themselves, but Refinitiv are now going to work with banks so they'll be able to check your social media posts. What has happened to me can very soon happen to you. And if it does, we start to move towards a China-style social credit system where our freedoms are gone, our liberty is gone, our ability to exist as ordinary human beings is gone unless we obey the accepted wisdom of the day. This is completely against free speech, completely against liberty, completely against democracy. And whilst I am absolutely fuming, at least with this document, I have got the truth. That is what is happening in modern Britain. We need radical change to legislation. We've got to change the PEP status rules. Otherwise, high-profile figures, people who could contribute to Parliament, won't go into politics if their children and their parents are at threat of having their bank account closed. We need a completely different attitude towards businesses that take cash. They're not all crooks. If you're running a market stall selling fish, you are going to take cash. And we need the right for everybody in this country, the right for everybody in this country to have a bank account and their own business account. I've given you a snapshot of all of this. You're going to get a lot more this evening. The Daily Telegraph have had full access to all of this. I'll be saying a lot more on my GB News show at 7 o'clock tonight. And if you want to be kept in touch with this and other issues that pretty much nobody else is talking about, please subscribe to this YouTube channel. Please subscribe to GB News's YouTube channel. There's a lot more where this came from.
That is a hell of a story, isn't it? I mean, it's just absolutely, completely absurd that they would close his bank account over those things. And it is true that the BBC printed a lie about it. The bank tried to spin it. Coutts tried to spin it. The bank tried to say that he didn't have enough money in his account, and BBC went for it and told the story. They didn't even ask Nigel Farage what the truth was. So this is a perfect microcosm. And you should care. I know it's Britain, but you should care because stuff that happens in Britain kind of happens here about 6 months later. We actually got the ball rolling, obviously, in the trucker bank accounts being frozen. And I wish some of those people had gone public more in a larger way. I will say this, though, that if anybody in the country who listens to this show, anybody in Canada where we're podcasting from, has their bank account closed for those kinds of reasons, or you suspect that, get in touch with somebody in indie media, Rebel News, Andrew Lawton, True North, me, call Rupa. I mean, there's lots of us out here who will try to do for you what Nigel Farage was able to do for himself. That the only way to get ahead in these things is to shame them. Shame them. So, and also keep using cash, demand that you want to use cash, don't kill cash. I'm going to get some hats with that printed because the more, understand this, that this is the beginning of what it will look like when we only have digital money. Now you have a look into the mindset of the people in banks. If they don't like the fact that we drive a gas guzzler, that won't align with their values. Or the fact that we give to a politician who wants to get some of the smut out of schools, oh, that won't align with their values. I mean, think about it. Cash takes away from our anonymity, too. It gives them control. So, cash doesn't take away from losing cash, takes away from our anonymity. So that's one of the reasons they're doing it. You'll also probably notice in your city that the big banks are closing branches and branches are becoming open less. I mean, think about it from their perspective. If they get us all on digital money, they don't really need branches, do they? Except a few here and there. Think of all the money and staff they'll save. It's perfect. While telling us this is the best thing since sliced bread. Don't fall for it, people. Do not fall for that. Anyway, so that is the Nigel Farage story. And the postscript is that he did get an apology from Dame or Lady, whoever it is that's running Coots, or maybe running NatWest that owns Coots. And she apologized, but didn't offer him his bank account back at Coots. She offered it back at NatWest, which is a different system. He wants his old account at Coots Bank, and he should get it. And if he doesn't get it, he should keep going. And I cheer for that. Okay. This is something that's going to make you really happy. Emma Jo Morris, the woman who broke the Hunter Biden laptop story for the New York Post and was excoriated for it and had the story censored by everybody, big tech, all the news media. 50 former spooks signed a note saying it was a Russian disinformation op. What a joke. What a joke. It wasn't safe to actually acknowledge the truthfulness of it until Joe Biden was safely installed in the White House. We all know that's what happened. Anyway, she was testifying on Capitol Hill about her part in that story. And I want you to listen to this very, very courageous young woman. She's somebody to really admire and who gives me some hope that at least portions of the independent news media will maintain. Anyway, her name is Emma Jo Morris.
The motion to table is agreed to. We will now move to our second witness. Ms. Morris, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me. My name is Emma Jo Morris, politics editor at Breitbart. I'm here today because I published a series of news stories 3 years ago in October of 2020 about Hunter Biden's now infamous laptop, also known as the laptop from hell, which is seen as some of the most scandalous reporting of the last decade. What was more scandalous than the reporting itself, though, was the fact that it exposed the unholy alliance between the intelligence community, social media platforms, and legacy media outlets. At the time, I was deputy politics editor at the New York Post, and my reporting showed that despite then candidates Joe Biden's repeated and furious denials, he was apparently involved in the foreign business deals of his family. Over several days, just weeks before Americans would vote for their next president, I revealed verified, authentic emails from the Biden Scion's hard drive showing Ukrainian business partners receiving leaks from the Obama White House. I documented an off-the-books meeting between then Vice President Biden and a Ukrainian energy executive and introduced the world to the big guy who got action on a deal with CEFC, China Energy Company. The Post published exactly how the material for the reporting was obtained, even identifying our sources, as well as a federal subpoena showing the FBI was in possession of the material the story was based on and had been since December of 2019. But when the stories appeared on social media that morning, the venue where millions of Americans go to find their news and editors to get their angles, within hours, the reporting was censored on all major platforms on the basis of being called hacked or Russian disinformation. Twitter refused to allow users to share the link to the stories, banned the links from being shared in private messages, a policy, by the way, that's used to clamp down on child porn, and locked the Post out of its verified account. Facebook said it would curb distribution and reach of the links on its platform. However, the stories were not based on hacked materials, nor were they Russian disinformation. And despite those claims appearing to come out of thin air at the time, we would eventually learn that they actually didn't come out of thin air at all. On October 19th, 5 days after the Post began publishing, Politico ran a story headlined, "Hunter Biden's story is Russian disinfo, dozens of former intel officials say." God, I can't even say that with a straight face, you know? Politico printed a letter completely uncritically from veteran members of the U.S. intelligence community, falsely claiming that the Post expose has, quote, all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. My God. Most notable among the signatories of that letter were Jim Clapper from former DNI, Michael Hayden, former CIA, John Brennan, former CIA, despite having such damaged credibility following their participation in the Russia collusion conspiracy theory. A few days later, on October 22nd, when Biden appeared in the second presidential debate and was confronted with the facts of the Post's reporting, he said to Trump, quote, 50 former national intelligence professionals said this. What he's accusing me of is a Russian plot. But it was not. And he knew that. Now, fast forward to this year, 3 years later. Just last spring, House investigators revealed it was a call by now Secretary of State Antony Blinken to former acting CIA Director Michael Morell that prompted the spy letter published by Politico, which bypassed agency approval processes that would have been normally applied. It is also now known that ahead of my reporting, federal agencies were priming social media companies to execute an operation to discredit it. According to internal documents released by Elon Musk upon his acquisition of Twitter, the FBI and other intelligence community members essentially directed the platform's censorship operation, in part externally by working with top management and in part internally by social media companies hiring eye-popping numbers of agency alumni. Journalist Michael Schallenberger reported, based on documents he obtained from Musk, that during all of 2020, the FBI and other law enforcement agencies repeatedly primed Twitter executives to dismiss reports of Hunter Biden's laptop as a Russian hack and leak operation. Feds arranged for top secret security clearances to be granted to Twitter management and even had encrypted messaging networks set up, which they dubbed a virtual war room. To this day, hundreds of people from the intelligence community work at social media companies. Over the last few years, my reporting has been confirmed by virtually every mainstream news outlet, from the Washington Post to the New York Times to Politico, when the stakes were nothing, by the way, 2 years later. No one denies that the laptop is real, that the origin story is exactly what I told you it was in the first place. This elaborate censorship conspiracy wasn't because the information being reported on was false. It was because it was true, and it was a threat to the power centers in this country. What this relationship between the U.S. government officials and American corporations represent is an unprecedented push to undermine the First Amendment, the right to think, write, read, say whatever we want. And how we respond will determine whether we see a free press as inalienable or as optional. Thanks.
So that does restore my faith in young reporters. She's over at Breitbart News now, but wasn't she magnificent? And she was absolutely right to laugh. It's appropriate to laugh at the absurdity of these people and the things that they pull off. Not so funny is that the man responsible for trying to hide the Biden family perfidy is none other than Antony Blinken. He is the guy who was behind getting that fake letter of 50 so-called former intelligence professionals to say it was a Russian intel op. He did that. And what was his reward? His reward was he's now Secretary of State, the most high diplomatic position maybe in the world. That's who's doing it. A guy prepared to lie in order to get his boss elected, pulling a fast one, not only on the media, who were stupid, but the American people. They don't care about us. They care only about power. And the fact that Antony Blinken is the guy that organized that letter should disqualify him from holding that office. And if, the Republicans did anything more than write really mean letters when they catch out the Democrats, he would be being impeached right now for that. He would be being, well, can you impeach somebody for something that happened before? I don't know, but there's lots of reason to impeach him now anyway. So that's how these things roll. I want to just read to you something. Karl Stanley spoke about the Bohemian Grove, and unless you think it's a conspiracy theory, it is not. It's a real thing. Bohemian Grove is a restricted 2,700-acre campground at 2601 Bohemian Avenue in Monterey, California, belonging to a private San Francisco-based gentlemen's club known as the Bohemian Club. In mid-July each year, Bohemian Grove hosts a more than 2-week encampment of some of the most prominent men in the world. So that's what he was talking about, Stockton Rush being a member of that particular club. It sounds kind of like this scary thing, and it may well be, but it is a real deal. They do meet. It is very, very secretive, men only. And it's a bunch of rich guys sitting around talking. And that's never a good thing. A bunch of rich guys sitting around in private talking is never good because their egos run away with them and they end up wanting to run the world like they are right now. So that's that. I have one final thing to announce and then I will say goodbye. The Free Speech in Medicine Conference is underway again, coming up in October, end of October. It's one of the most fun things you will ever do. And it's important to go and network with people who figured out how dire things are, but also people who are going to give you hope because they're so very clever and so very smart and thinking so deeply about it that it's like taking a warm bath. It's really great. Plus, it's in Bedeck, Nova Scotia, a brilliant place. I was there last year. I loved every minute of it. I got to meet my new friend, Jay Bhattacharya, and many other lovely, lovely people. So you should do it. If you can afford it, you should think about going. Let me tell you who's on the roster for this year. Dr. Gad Sad, who's been on my show, lovely guy, terribly clever. Aaron Cariati, who I have not met, but who I admire very much, and you can read his stuff on Brownstone. And he is way ahead of the curve. Senior scholar at Brownstone, psychiatrist working with the Unity Project. He's a former professor of psychiatry at UCal, Irvine, where he was the director of medical ethics. So he's got a lot to say. And I think he was removed. Yes, he was, for his stance on mandatory vaccination and other public health policies, safe and effective. Yeah, right. Okay. Rupa Subramanya, one of my favorite reporters who, along, I would say, with Viva Fry, they were the two reporters who really captured what was happening down in Ottawa at the Truckers Convention. She's terrific. I love her, and she's going to have a wonderful time out there. Lisa Bildy. Lisa Bildy is the lawyer for the gentleman I was speaking about at the top of the show who was being persecuted by the critical race theory people at the Toronto School Board. So she's a wonderful human being and a great lawyer and takes on a lot of causes around freedom and liberty, and she's wonderful. Amy Ham, a registered nurse, writer, journalist, and mother of two young boys, multi-year legal battle with the BC College of Nurses and Midwives for her off-duty conduct and publicly supporting author J.K. Rowling and repeatedly stating that males cannot be females. So that's great. Ken Zucker, another great brain on the trans issue. Jewish American Canadian psychologist and sexologist, head of the Child and Adolescent Gender Identity Clinic at Toronto Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. Zucker is considered an international authority in the field of gender identity in children and in adolescents. So he's really smart too. Eris Lavranos, Julian Summers, John Carpe, who I know from the JCCF, and I think the rock star of the whole deal is going to be Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who is my spirit animal. He is the subject of a doc made by a friend of mine who is actually producing the doc I'm working on now called The Divided Brain. If you haven't seen it, you must watch it. And he wrote a book about it, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. Terribly, terribly clever, groundbreaking way of thinking things. It's like just a wonderful way to immerse yourself in people who are thinking critically and have figured out a lot of things about our world that are bedeviling us. Think about going. It's end of October, and I know that the registration is just going up now, and there are tickets for sale there. So go to the Free Speech in Medicine 2023 conference website, and you will find all that information there. And I will say to you now, stay critical, and we will see ya. Bye.